2 weeks before the Halloween of 2003, New Line Cinema released director Marcus Nispel's remake of Tobe Hooper's seminal horror film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Produced by Michael Bay and co-produced by Tobe Hooper, the film recouped over 10 times its budget at the box office, despite largely negative critical reviews. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is rather infamous for being unavailable in the UK for many years. BBFC Secretary Stephen Murphy saw the film informally in early 1975, but expressed to the distributors that the film's overt presentation of abnormal psychology was unsuitable for an X certificate, the equivalent of today's 18 rating. The distributors made some minor cuts, particularly to the family dinner scene towards the end of the film, and formally submitted the film for a BBFC certificate on March 12, 1975. Since there was very little in the way of explicit gore and violence, even before these cuts had been made, the BBFC felt that the cuts to the film had done nothing to change the overall grim tone of the picture. 2 days later, the BBFC banned the film. However, since statutory powers on film remain with local councils, councils may overrule any of the BBFC's decisions, including passing films the board rejects, and vice versa, waiving cuts or making new ones, and even changing the ratings of films that are exhibited under their own licensing jurisdiction. As a result, the Greater London Council issued Chainsaw with their own uncut X certificate in 1975, and 9 other councils also issued X ratings for the film. 19 councils upheld the BBFC ban. Stephen Murphy stepped down as secretary in the summer of 1975 and was replaced by James Furman. Furman was asked to re-evaluate Chainsaw on at least 2 occasions in the late 1970s, but agreed with his predecessor that the sustained terrorization of the film's female victims was too much for an X certificate. Perhaps one of the more famous of Furman's quotes was his reference to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as the pornography of terror. By the early 1980s, the home video market was in its infancy, and until 1985, there was no requirement for videos in the UK to be classified by the BBFC. Chainsaw was thus released on video without a BBFC rating. By the time the Video Recordings Act was introduced in the mid-1980s, the film's distributors spoke with the board about the possibility of making cuts in order to produce an officially sanctioned BBFC version. These requests were not granted, and the pre-cert version was removed from the shelves after the introduction of the Video Recordings Act. The BBFC later commented on the film in the late 1990s that
the reason that the film was refused certification was the result of the perceived degree of terrorization of women and threat to defenseless women. The board has for many years operated a very strict policy with regard to sexual violence based on the incidence of this sort of behavior in real life, and the fact that a great deal of research does indicate that this is the one area where media representations do seem to have quite direct effects on attitudes and behavior. The film was rejected by the board on film and is most unlikely to be classified on video.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre remained unavailable to UK audiences until 1998, when, following a series of exclusive screenings in Camden and the London Film Festival, which was taking place just 5 minutes' walk from the BBFC's offices, it was resubmitted for a theatrical BBFC certificate in 1999. It was passed uncut with an 18 rating, and VHS and DVD classifications quickly followed, and the film has been available uncut in the UK since then. By this time, it is worth noting that James Furman had left the BBFC. Following the film's classification in the UK, the BBFC issued a second statement. Despite the steadfast nature of the first statement just weeks before, their second took on a decidedly different tone.
There is, so far as the board is aware, no evidence that harm has ever arisen as a consequence of viewing the film. For modern young adults, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is unlikely to be particularly challenging. Possibly the most notorious feature is the relentless pursuit of the final girl throughout the last half hour or so of the film. The heroine in peril is a staple of the cinema since the earliest days. it is nonetheless legitimate to question the unusual emphasis the Texas Chainsaw Massacre places on the pursuit of a defenseless and screaming female over such an extended period. The board's conclusion, after careful consideration, was that any possible harm that might arise in terms of the effect upon a modern audience would be more than sufficiently countered by the unrealistic, even absurd, nature of the action itself. It is worth emphasizing that there is no explicit sexual element in the film, and relatively little visible violence.
4 years later in 2003, Marcus Nispel's remake posed no issues with the BBFC, although the version the board classified 18 was the R-rated version as released in the United States. 2 scenes had been censored to satisfy the demands of the MPAA, and in this episode of the show, we'll be taking a look at the cuts that were made to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to avoid an NC-17 rating. The first scene to receive cuts was the suicide of the hitchhiker at the start of the film. This is Marcus Nispel's original assembly of the scene, which the MPAA cited as being a deciding factor in awarding an NC-17.
You're all gonna die.
Grab it!
A few minor trims were made to retain an R rating, including a reduction in the splattering of blood and brain matter, and the sight of the hitchhiker's severed ear falling into the lap of Pepper in the van. Nispel later commented on the scene and expanded upon the cuts he was forced to make, remarking, "You work on a movie like this too long, you develop a low threshold for those type of events. In the actual cut, the blood is less red, which I think is actually much scarier in a way. I like that it's dark, and I never like blood that looks like syrup or ketchup or whatever." As a result of these changes, the slightly truncated R version plays as follows.
You're all gonna die.
Grab it!
The second sequence to receive trims was the killing of Morgan at the hands of Leatherface. Here is how the scene played in Nispel's original cut of the film. Nispel was less enamoured with the MPAA's decision in this instance, as he later recounted. "Nobody wants to see on camera how somebody gets sliced from below, so we shot cutaways, his face screaming, and a little blood splattering against the wall. But even that seemed to be too much for many, so 2 shots had to go out, which really don't show you all that much. But somehow it leaves me wondering what had really happened to him by removing them." In essence, the explicit sight of the chainsaw approaching and cutting into Morgan's groin was eliminated, along with the sight of blood splashing and his insides falling out and onto the floor. After cuts for an R rating, the scene plays as follows. After cuts were made, New Line Cinema was granted an R rating for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre by the MPAA for strong horror violence/gore, language, and drug content. Unfortunately for horror fans, neither an NC-17 version or an unrated version was released on DVD or Blu-ray. As a result, the standard version released throughout the world is the censored R-rated version. Having said that, the release of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 2003 kickstarted the Hollywood trend of remaking old-school horror films of the 1970s and 1980s, and in the years that followed, the Hollywood studios began to see the potential of offering extended versions of horror films on home video. To name but one example, Nispel's remake of Friday the 13th in 2009 was first released with an R rating in theatres, with a so-called killer cut following on home video with added sexuality and violence. The material excised from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is still vaulted and fully sound mixed, so there appears to be no reason for the lack of an unrated edition of the film now or further down the line. Perhaps one day we shall see an uncut version, which will most likely be released to tie in with another remake, reboot or remake of the remake in a few years' time. Until then, fans can pick up the Texas Chainsaw Massacre on Blu-ray, knowing that they are getting the most complete version of the film that has been released to date.
The infamous Cash and Tango.